Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we're diving into a tense, emotional moment between Diep and James, a night where one decision could change everything. Diep finds James in hiding and asks him to come back, not with anger, but with a kind of honesty that's impossible to ignore. If you enjoy emotional storytelling with deep feelings, quiet pain, and love tested by fear, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. "If you don't come back tonight," Diep whispered, her voice so quiet it barely survived the cold air, "I'm going to lose the courage to keep believing you ever will." James didn't move. For a second, even the street seemed to stop breathing the distant engines, the stray dog barking somewhere behind the workshop, the faint buzz of the streetlight above them. Everything narrowed into that one sentence, and the way it turned Diep's steady face into something raw. She stood right on the edge of the light, shoulders tense inside a jacket that wasn't warm enough. Her hair was pulled back like she'd done it without looking in a mirror. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers curled tight, as if she was holding herself together by force. James stared at her like he'd been struck without a fist. The night had always made him feel invisible. By day, he could disappear inside noisework, sweat, the simple grind of effort that didn't ask questions. But at night, when the tools were silent and the world went thin, everything he tried to bury came back like a second heartbeat. That's why he'd chosen this place, a small rented room behind an old workshop, half hidden from the main road, one thin mattress, a clean shirt folded like a promise he wasn't sure he deserved, a life trimmed down to the bare minimum, no fights, no plans, no revenge, no people to drag down with him. He'd been sitting on the low step outside, elbows on his knees, watching a streetlight flicker like it couldn't decide whether to stay on. His knuckles were scraped. His palms were rough, pain that made sense, pain he could measure. Then a scooter had slowed too close. He hadn't turned right away. His body already knew the air had changed. "James!" Her voice didn't shake, it didn't break. It was controlled, and somehow that was worse than crying, like she'd been holding herself together with both hands all day just to get here. He stood, slow but not relaxed, instincts tight, not fear for himself, fear for the damage that followed him. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Diep took one step closer, then stopped, like there was an invisible line she was afraid to cross. "I looked for you. I didn't know if you were still in town. You found me." He kept his voice flat on purpose, like a shield. "Now go." Her lips pressed together. She didn't move. "Diep, it's late." He glanced down the road, then back at her. "You shouldn't be seen with me." "I don't care." The words came out sharp, then softened immediately. "I care. I can't do this anymore." Something heavy dropped into his chest. He folded his arms not to look tough, but to keep his hands from reaching for her without permission. "Do what?" "Pretend I'm okay," she said, and her gaze slid past him toward the dark little room, as if she could already feel the loneliness living in there. "Pretend that you disappearing is something I can accept." His jaw tightened. "You can accept it. You have to." She let out a single laugh that held no humor. "That's easy for you to say. You get to choose to be alone. I don't. He felt the urge to argue, to build the wall higher, to shut the night down before it made him weak. Why are you here, Diep? Her eyes lifted to his bright, exhausted, determined. Come home. 2 simple words, and the air between them cracked. James didn't answer. His silence landed heavy, immediate, like a door closing quietly. Diep stepped closer again, and this time she crossed the line. She came fully into the streetlight's reach, close enough for him to see the faint red mark on her thumb, like she'd been gripping something too hard, close enough to see how carefully she was keeping her voice steady. You can't say that, he muttered, as if the words themselves were dangerous. I can, her chin lifted. I'm saying it now. Come back, live with us. Us. The word hit him like a memory. He hadn't allowed himself to touch 3 cups on a table, small shoes by the door, mornings that didn't start with silence. He shook his head once, quick and firm, like he could stop the feeling if he moved fast enough. No. Diep didn't flinch. Why? You know why. He looked away because looking at her was a risk. Because I bring trouble. Because I don't get to have a normal life. Because you decided you don't deserve one, she cut in. His gaze snapped back to her. Diep's breathing was shallow now. She was forcing herself not to fall apart right in front of him. You left because you thought you were protecting me, she said. But you're not protecting me, James. You're punishing me. I'm not. You are. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she blinked hard, angry at her own tears. I wake up and the house is quiet, and I tell myself it's fine. I cook and I clean and I keep moving because I don't have a choice. But at night, her hands curled into fists. At night, I hear every sound outside and I freeze. I keep thinking if something happens, who will I call? Who will run to the door? His face stayed still, but his eyes betrayed him. Diep stepped closer until there was barely space between them. I'm not asking you to save me, she whispered. I'm asking you to stay. James's hands twitched at his sides, restrained. If I go back, they'll find you. They'll use you to get to me. Who? Diep demanded, even though the answer burned between them. Your father? A shadow moved across his expression. Old rage, old pain, the kind he'd tried to drown in manual labor and silence. I walked away from that, he said, quieter now. I stopped. I'm done chasing revenge. I'm done fighting him. I just want a peaceful life. A tear slipped down Diep's cheek. She didn't wipe it. Then come home, she said. That's the peaceful life. He let out a bitter laugh under his breath and gestured at himself, the scraped knuckles, the cheap life, the emptiness he wore like armor. This is peaceful. No one gets hurt because I'm not near them. Diep shook her head slowly. That's not peace, she said. That's exile. The streetlight flickered again. For a heartbeat, her face looked younger, softer, like the woman who once believed he could be more than his name, more than his father's shadow. She took a breath and her voice dropped to something dangerously honest. One sentence, Diep said, eyes locked on his, and you'll understand why I'm here. His mouth went dry. Diep. She swallowed, then let the words fall soft as a whisper, sharp as a blade. If you don't come back tonight, she said, I'm going to lose the courage to keep believing you ever will." James went completely still, and for the first time since she arrived, he had no answer at all, only silence, cracked open, and Diep watched him like she was staring at the last door left in her life, waiting to see if it would finally open. James's throat worked like he was swallowing something jagged. The streetlight buzzed again, and in that thin slice of light, his face finally betrayed him fear, not of his father, but of failing her. Diep didn't reach for him. She just stood there, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to respect the wall he'd built. "You think silence is safer?" she whispered. "But it's killing me." He shut his eyes for half a second, like he needed darkness to choose truth. Then, finally, his voice, rough from disuse and stubborn pride. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," James said. The words hit Diep like a sudden breath after being underwater. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a shaky inhale. "I left," he continued, forcing each syllable out like it weighed 100 pounds, "because I love you too much to watch my mess swallow your life." Diep's eyes burned. "So you decided for me." His jaw tightened. "I decided I wouldn't drag you into my father's storm." "And what if I'm already in it?" she snapped, voice trembling. "What if the storm followed you into my house the moment you touched my hand?" James flinched because she was right. He'd been pretending distance could erase danger. He looked at her really, the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders stayed lifted, ready to brace for impact, the bravery it took to come here alone. "I'm tired, Diep," he admitted, the confession almost breaking him. "I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of waking up and feeling like I'm a weapon someone else built." Diep stepped closer, slow, careful. "Then don't be a weapon," she said. "Be a man who comes home." His breath shook. "If I go back, it won't be quiet." "It doesn't have to be quiet," she replied. "It just has to be together." James stared at her for a long moment, as if measuring whether hope would cost her too much. Then his shoulders dropped just a little, like he was finally setting something down. "One condition," he said. Diep blinked. "Anything!" He lifted his hand, hovering near her cheek without touching, asking without words. "If danger gets close," James said, voice low, "you listen to me. You don't argue. You don't try to be brave alone." A tear slipped free, and this time Diep didn't fight it. She nodded once. "Deal." James exhaled, long and broken, like he'd been holding his breath for days. "Okay," he said, small, fierce, real. "I'll come home."
Diệp lần theo dấu vết James đến một xưởng nhỏ ẩn náu vào đêm khuya, không chấp nhận sự biến mất lặng lẽ của anh. James cố gắng đẩy cô ra xa, khăng khăng rằng khoảng cách duy nhất để bảo vệ cô khỏi cái bóng của cha anh và mối nguy hiểm gắn liền với anh. Nhưng Diệp tiết lộ cái giá của sự im lặng của anh, nỗi sợ hãi, sự cô đơn, sự sụp đổ dần dần hy vọng. Câu nói duy nhất của cô cùng khiến anh gục ngã, buộc James phải thừa nhận rằng anh không bỏ đi vì ngừng yêu cô, mà vì anh yêu cô quá nhiều đến nỗi anh không thể để sự hỗn loạn của mình hủy hoại cuộc đời cô. Diệp thách thức anh ngừng tự mình quyết định kiệt sức vì chạy trốn. James đồng ý trở về với một điều kiện: nếu nguy hiểm đến gần, Diệp phải lắng nghe và không bao giờ đối mặt với nó một mình.